After nearly 2,000 years, Jesus of Nazareth still captivates the minds and imaginations of modern people. But are there good reasons to trust in Jesus' message of love and forgiveness? One line of evidence comes from a very ancient prediction found in Psalm 22. 1,000 years before Jesus of Nazareth ever walked the earth, the Hebrew Scriptures predicted the method of Jesus' death with startling accuracy. In a moment of profound agony, Jesus shrieked these painful words from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" In Jesus' day, rabbis would regularly quote the first line of a psalm to refer to the entire poem, and therefore, Jesus must have wanted his hearers to read, remember, and reflect on the contents of this particular chapter in the Hebrew Bible. As we read through this ancient psalm, we discover why he wanted these to be his parting words to humanity. Psalm 22 describes a man in abject agony, weeping and groaning before God. And yet, while this figure honestly shares his pain, he doesn't despair, still expressing trust and confidence in the goodness of God. The psalm depicts onlookers ridiculing and despising and sneering at this man's immovable faith, taunting his trust in God's deliverance and rescue. Yet this faithful martyr doesn't succumb to their derision. Instead, he perseveres, remembering how God has been with him since his very birth. No one comes to the aid of this righteous man, only more enemies appear. The text portrays his enemies as a drove of bulls. Later, they are described as dogs and lions. Finally, we realize that these are all poetic descriptions of a band of evildoers. The subsequent lines of the psalm become even more vivid. The man's bones are pulled out of joint. Physicians tell us that during crucifixion, the shoulders and elbows of the victim become dislocated, gruesomely stretching the victim's arms an additional 6 inches in length. Next, the psalm reports the dehydration of this suffering victim. His tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth, leaving him on death's door. But the prediction gets even more specific. A band of evildoers pierce his hands and his feet. Remember, this imagery was written 500 years before crucifixion was even invented, and 1,000 years before Jesus of Nazareth ever walked the earth. As the crucified man writhes in agony, the onlookers stare at his exposed body, and his torturers gamble for his clothing. In this nightmarish scene, the suffering victim has only one hope. He calls out to God to deliver him from death. And then, the prediction takes an unexpected turn. Up until this point, it looked as though all hope was lost, and the man had suffered until he was laid in the dust of death. Here, however, this righteous man continues to live on, praising God to all of the people around him. He tells the people of Israel to praise God and to stand in awe of him. The prediction describes all the ends of the earth and all the families of the nations as coming to worship God as a result of his suffering. What is it about this one man's suffering that would cause people from across the globe to come to faith in God? What is it about this man's death that future generations would come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born? At the cross, Jesus of Nazareth paid for the moral failings of the human race, drawing innumerable people into a relationship with the God of the Bible. It is of little wonder that Psalm 22 would close with the words, "He has performed it," and Jesus could end his life with the words, "It is finished." Not everyone is willing to accept this as genuine predictive prophecy about Jesus. Some critics of this prediction argue that this passage cannot describe Jesus. After all, King David is the author of the psalm, and he writes about himself in the first person. While this is a fair objection, it suffers from at least 3 crucial difficulties. First of all, David didn't die this way. David died peacefully in his bed of old age, surrounded by his friends and loved ones. Furthermore, in the dozens and dozens of chapters that describe David's life, we read nothing about David being surrounded by his enemies as they pierce his hands and feet. Second, David wrote other psalms which are interpreted as predictive prophecy, not as mere poetry. Lastly, we know that this psalm is not autobiographical, because David's death never had a universal impact on the world. People from across the globe do not venerate David's death today. And yet, there was one Jewish man's death that did have such a global impact, turning billions of people to trust in the God of Israel, Jesus of Nazareth. Other critics argue that Psalm 22 does not predict the crucifixion because of verse 16. While most English translations read, "They pierced my hands and feet," critics note that many early Hebrew manuscripts actually read, "Like a lion, my hands and feet." The debate centers around two Hebrew words, ka'aru, which means pierced, or ka'ari, which means like a lion. Critics charge that Psalm 22 did not originally contain the word pierced, but rather, this was a later copyist error, or maybe even a Christian interpolation. And yet, this objection fails for a number of reasons also. For one, our oldest Jewish translation of this passage dates to at least 2 centuries before Jesus, and it renders this passage as pierced. Second, our oldest Hebrew copy of Psalm 22:16 reads, "They pierced my hands and feet." And finally, the "like a lion" reading is grammatically awkward. Like a lion, my hands and feet? What does this even mean? The sentence is grammatical nonsense because it doesn't contain a verb. More extreme skeptics believe that Jesus didn't fulfill this prediction because, they assert, that Jesus never existed. But this is not a persuasive objection at all. Even atheistic and agnostic historians believe that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the firmest facts of history. For instance, atheistic New Testament critic Bart Ehrman stated that one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified. Likewise, John Dominic Crossan, one of the founders of the Skeptical Jesus Seminar, wrote that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. And finally, atheistic New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann wrote that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. In every one of his recorded prayers, Jesus referred to God as his Father, except only once, as he hung like a butchered animal on a Roman cross. At the cross of Christ, God the Father gave up his Son so that we could become his sons. And Jesus gave up his Father so that we could come to know his Father.